While Superman has definitely gotten a lot of content in the 21st century, either in animation or live action, TV, or movies, one type of content that's been missing is an animated TV show, which Superman hasn't had in 23 years since Superman the Animated Series ended in the year 2000. Now, just 2 weeks after Superman and Lois Season 3 ended, and the next cinematic Superman and Lois were cast, we have the debut of the long-awaited return to a Superman animated series with My Adventures with Superman, which I thought, like I was mostly able to tell from the trailers, this show is pretty delightful. This video will be a review of My Adventures with Superman episodes 1 and 2, titled Adventures of a Normal Man Part 1 and Part 2. Now right off the bat, this is an animated series, so let's talk about the art style and animation. The art style is clearly inspired by anime, which gives it a very unique feel to it in the realm of superhero media, while also making all the main characters really cute, which helps them come off as really likable, while the villains do look cool for the most part. The characters do also look at least a bit different from the comics, or how they typically look. Clark's symbol is more edged than usual, and he purposely portrayed as much cuter, even as Clark, than he typically is. Lois is maybe a bit shorter than usual, while also having short hair, and Jimmy follows the precedent that was set by Supergirl, and was followed up on multiple times in making Jimmy black. Additionally, Livewire is a different ethnicity than usual, Deathstroke looks far younger. All of these changes alongside the art style and animation style make the show feel like a very unique and fresh take on the Superman world, while also not deviating too much from what we know. Jimmy is black, but that's something that's so easy to forget this time around, as he still looks and feels like Jimmy Olsen. The art style is super charming, and the character designs are super unique and fresh. As for the animation, which is a completely separate thing from the art style, I think is mostly really good. The anime style, flowing movement, 3D camera action scenes are exciting, and a lot of the characters' movements or the faces that they make feel like they were deliberately done to amplify their cuteness, which seems to be a huge focus of this show, to make these characters super cute, which works really well for the charming tone and focus on the flirting between Clark and Lois that they are going for. I will say, I did maybe start to notice during episode 2 that the city does feel a bit empty, or lacking background characters, and a lot of the time the background is far less detailed, which might have been purposeful, but it does give off a bit of a vibe of it being a bit cheap. It's not nearly distracting enough to ruin the show, as most of the time, and for the most part, the animation is very solid. But let's talk about the characters, because that's maybe the best thing about this show so far. I'm so glad that between Superman and Lois putting Lois in the title, Superman Legacy apparently giving big roles to Lois and Jimmy, and this show being called My Adventures with Superman, which implies that Lois and Jimmy are just as much the main characters as Clark is, as they represent the My in the title. I'm really glad that Superman's supporting cast is being re-embraced in the media after the 2010s seemed to care for them less, especially Jimmy Olsen. I found the three main characters to be so delightful and fun to watch in these two episodes, with all three being incredibly likable. Jimmy is genuinely funny and really feels like he's Clark and Lois' best friend. Clark and Lois' immediate flirting is absolutely my favorite portrayal of the beginning of their relationship. I so much prefer Lois liking Clark and not Superman, like they did on Superman and Lois, because it really makes Lois feel less shallow. That's something I didn't like about Superman the Animated Series, and maybe the only thing. I'm already loving how it's being handled on this show. Independently, Clark has the perfect wholesome Clark Kent and Superman energy. Lois has the perfect amount of stubbornness and determination, and Jimmy is a pretty perfect modernization of the character of Jimmy Olsen without deviating too much from the character of Jimmy Olsen. If nothing else, I love this show's main three characters, and I think their voice actors fit the roles perfectly as well. I never would have thought Huey from The Boys would be a good Superman, but he is. The story of these two episodes is all about Clark starting his job as an intern at the Daily Planet, meeting Lois Lane, being forced into needing to use his powers, and finally becoming Superman. Before that, however, both episodes actually begin with scenes of Clark as a child discovering his powers in episode 1 and finding out about his spaceship in episode 2. I don't know if this is just a first two episodes thing or if this will continue, but I love these cold open flashbacks that tell their own contained one-scene stories when Clark was a kid, and then also connects to the present day and the rest of the episode. And honestly, I think it'd be a fantastic idea to continue this concept going forward, which would be like this show's identity at the beginning of each episode. but I really doubt that they will, especially since it did seem like after Clark was spooked by the spaceship, he didn't return to it until the present day, nor did he really decide to use his powers much at all. This is, again, definitely a slightly different take on Superman, but certainly a valid one. I will say it's interesting that Clark wore glasses as a kid. Maybe he was actually completely normal until he unlocked his powers in the scene in episode 1. And he did have some eye problems. Maybe he needed glasses for real. From there, the story becomes about Clark, Jimmy, and Lois heading to the Daily Planet. First of all, I think it's really cool that Clark and Jimmy are actually roommates on this show. It's one of those modernizations of these characters that I think really works. Clark forgetting his strength and breaking things due to his nervousness about his first day, and his determination to just be a normal person, which he has a hard time sticking to, was a charming, likable, and fun introduction to this version, or at least the adult version, of Clark Kent. Similarly really charming was the introduction of Lois, but also especially the meeting of the two. The story definitely moves really fast from there as we jump to the introduction to the villains and their giant robots, which the trio immediately go after. I know these episodes are short, but yeah, the pacing did feel a bit off there, maybe because the episode had a lot of introductions to get through between Clark, his parents, Lois, Jimmy, Perry, the Newsboy Legion, as well as the villains, which is quite a bit, and it did feel like the story was moving by really quickly. This might have also caused not just the conflict with the villains, but also the conflict between the main characters to feel like they came pretty quickly. Pacing aside, I did like these conflicts. Clark feeling used by Lois felt very natural, and Lois feeling bad for it felt very genuine. Maybe another layer of shallowness that Lois can sometimes have is not really caring much for how her hunger for a story can hurt others, and this showcased her caring, adding a dimension to Lois Lane. The following climax fight of the episode, where Clark fights a robot or two, was a pretty interesting one. The animation was fantastic, and the fight really felt difficult, which really surprised me since Superman struggled with one robot, and then like 5 more showed up. It genuinely felt like Superman didn't stand a chance, and he was also like getting bruised. He had actual bruises. This furthered the seemingly very different take on Superman, where he didn't have any powers until he was like 10, and now seems to have unlocked a new level of power due to being in a situation where he was forced to. Again, it's a unique take on Superman, especially with the blue glow and lightning that comes off of him, and even forms a logo. This seems to maybe be the beginning of the first adaptation of the Superman Red and Superman Blue story, where Superman developed energy-based powers and physically split into 2 entities. I don't think they will split him into 2, but given the energy, lightning, and very similar looking logo, I do think this particular version of Superman will have some sort of anime-style power-up or Saiyan form inspired by Superman Blue, and yeah, that fits really well with the anime style they have here. Episode 2 continues off of Episode 1, in particular with Lois and Jimmy going off on their own without Clark while he returns to his ship to discover where he's really from. Like I said earlier, Jimmy really does feel like Clark and Lois' best friend, which is showcased in this episode as Lois and Jimmy, without Clark, are super fun together as well. Clark's journey into his past is visually spectacular with very idiosyncratic visuals either in the ship itself, a holodeck Clark gets sent to, Krypton itself, or Superman's very anime suit-up sequence. This is definitely one part of the episode I really loved. It's chock full of originality and a story that's been told countless times before, with other non-visual elements as well, like Jor-El not speaking English, which I'm hoping gets followed up on with Clark actually learning Kryptonian. And something that I really loved is Clark getting this Kryptonian suit, but then Martha adding the trunks and belt to it, which gives the suit a really nice characteristic of being a combination of Clark's Kryptonian heritage and human upbringing. This whole sequence was one of the many highlights of these 2 episodes, maybe the best part of the 2, aside from Clark and Lois' flirting, which is also another highlight. One thing that wasn't necessarily a highlight, but also definitely not bad, was Leslie Willis, who in the comics is the Superman villain Livewire, who basically acted as the main villain of this 2-parter, which kind of feels like a callback to the previous Superman animated series, which is where Livewire debuted prior to the comics. Leslie is, again, a very unique take on this particular villain. Hell, in episode 1, throughout the entire thing, I absolutely had no idea she was Livewire. She seemed like a bit of a generic henchman leader who operated the robots, with her only real defining characteristic being her being frustrated with her men, which was admittedly fun at times. Leslie is far better in episode 2, as she has electric powers through some sort of technology, which made her far more interesting in both actually being Livewire and making her design far better. The tech giving her powers looks pretty cool, and the electricity also makes her hair go up, which looks far better. It definitely seems like Livewire was fused to her tech, giving her full-on electricity powers in the end, like she typically has, which is a cool way to do so. And it also seems to me that she might have been using some Kryptonian tech, as her crystal and lightning seems very similar to Superman's own lightning and some of his Kryptonian technology, but also Clark got some very interesting visions when he touched the crystal, maybe of the past or maybe of the future. This final climax to the first two parts of the episode, focusing on Superman's official debut and facing off against Livewire, was pretty great, with some great first shots of Superman, some fantastic animation, and a focus on Superman's debut not actually being about a fight with someone, but more so saving someone, or at least attempting to. This episode also introduced this show's version of Deathstroke, which is surprising they're using Deathstroke in the first episodes, considering Superman has a very similar villain that they could have used in Bloodsport. But this also makes the third time a very different version of Deathstroke appeared in a Superman show, and boy is he different. He kind of looks like a prototype version of Slade who's a good 10 to 20 years younger than Slade typically is, with a voice that, I'll be honest, doesn't really fit him. He's played by Chris Parnell, who is a hilarious voice actor, but I really couldn't hear anything aside from Jerry Smith from Rick and Morty when Slade spoke, which made Slade come off as more like he's comedic than cool or badass. This universe is very young in general, so I don't mind Deathstroke being used for Superman, because like the Teen Titans aren't around yet, but it's hard to take the voice seriously. The episode then ends on Lois and Jimmy getting out the Superman story, Lois and Clark almost kissing before finding out that they were kicked off the byline, and finally a bit of setup for some of who seem to be significant villains this season, but I doubt are the main villains, Amanda Waller and maybe Sam Lane, although that one I can't confirm. These final episodes were all pretty great, with Clark and Lois' scene being particularly amusing and fun to watch. In conclusion, I think that simply based off of the first two episodes, I already love my adventures with Superman, or at least I can definitely see myself loving this first season, which showcases very unique but true to form takes on the Superman characters who are simultaneously fantastic adaptations, but also fresh new takes, with this applying to the classic Superman story as well. The voice acting is almost entirely fantastic, with like one exception, but that's more so because he was maybe miscast, not necessarily that the voice acting is bad, because it isn't. The art style is super charming, especially in the character designs for Clark, Lois, and Jimmy, who are all very likable. The animation is really good for the most part, and the visuals can be very exciting at times. And while I didn't talk about it much, I found these two episodes to be very funny. I thought these episodes were really fun. I basically had a smile on my face the entire time while watching, because My Adventures with Superman exemplifies the perfect Superman energy, while also being a fresh new take on the classic characters and world. I'd give both of these episodes 8s out of 10s. I'm very excited for the future of this show, but also for Superman in general. There's going to be more My Adventures with Superman. There's at least 2 seasons confirmed. There is a Superman and Lois season 4, and of course, Superman Legacy. Superman is definitely entering a golden age of media.